Phineas Parkhurst Quimby declared by a journalist at the time that he was practicing that Ralph Waldo Emerson was the philosopher of this new movement that was called New Thought, and Quimby is the technician. And he was very scientific minded. He had a patent, among other things, for a sawmill and also for improving daguerreotypes, a form of photograph. And he often used the metaphor of how a daguerreotype worked to help people understand what it was he was doing in the treatment, which I thought was very interesting. When he was absolutely clear after his own personal experiences and after a number of experiments that the physical disorder was a function of a mental process, he began to understand or attempt to understand what the mental process was. So I'm going to read you something from the flyer that he would post. Now, in New England in the 1850s and 60s, you would go from town to town, do a lecture, and then follow that up with some kind of practice. Almost every medical practitioner did that at that time. And he had already had some experience doing that in the wintertime when he was exploring mesmerism, but now he is going around New England all times of year partly because the roads were improving, to share this new process. He was based in Portland, Maine for the first part of his healing process career, his practitioner career, and then in Belfast. So he says in his flyer, PPQ simply sits down by the patients, tells them their feelings and what they think is their disease. If the patients admit that he tells them their feelings, etc., then his explanation is the cure. And if he succeeds in correcting their error, he changes the fluids of the system and establishes the truth or health. The truth, capital T, is the cure. This mode of practice applies to all cases. If no explanation is given, no charge is made, for no effect is produced. Now, he would never turn away a patient, so often there was no charge made, even if there was an explanation. But what he's saying is, if he couldn't tell you what you were feeling and why you were feeling that way and talk you out of that, he would not charge you. I thought that was fascinating. So the first thing that he would do is he would sit in, people would come in. There were usually a dozen or so people in the waiting room, several of whom were students, talking about what they thought Quimby was doing and trying to understand it. And sometimes when he would come into the waiting room to pick up a new patient, he would add to their conversations. So sometimes the folks who had been there several times were getting the extra, if you will, the extra treatment of hearing how this all worked. So he would invite the person into his examining room, which is a small room with two chairs. That's it. He would almost never touch them. Sometimes he would touch them lightly on the head, on the shoulder, or on the hand for comfort, on the head if he thought there was some kind of maladjustment in the head, and on the shoulder if he needed to get their attention. Isn't that interesting? So he would sit there and initially not say anything. And if they went, rah, 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 and I got this and I have that, rah, 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 and he'd listen. But what he was doing was going deeper with them. He was going as deeply as he could. His job, as he saw it, was not to be there as the natural or normal man, but to be there as capital W wisdom. So one of the things that he said is that the power of wisdom can condense mind into a solid, wow, right? And then he said, God made man of ideas. Man is a compound idea. The natural man must become subject to the wisdom of what he called scientific man. He believed that he was using the science that Jesus Christ used. So he was the one who invented the term, the science of Christ. The natural man must become subject to the wisdom of the scientific man. When we identify ourselves as God's image, then the new birth begins. All effects in the outer world have their cause in the spiritual world because God is the only creative mechanism. And God, spirit, wisdom, truth are all the same thing in his language. So he saw his job as being present to the person, not as a man, not as Phineas Parkhurst Quimby, but as the embodiment of wisdom, able to see what was really going on for this person, and then use whatever words came through him to describe that. As one of his, Quimby had several students. The one that inherited his documents was Julius Dresser and his wife Annette Dresser. And it was their grandson Horatio who published the first edition of Quimby's manuscripts in the 1920s. So the period between 1866, when he last worked, and 1920 something was a real vacant space as far as Quimby was concerned. But Annette Dresser said, Quimby listened to patients explain their ailments. Quimby would then diagnose and explain their phenomena in a way that the patient could understand. He called these diagnoses the truth, underscoring how the body was a vessel for the faculties of the human mind. She talks about that in a book called The Philosophy of Phineas Parkhurst Quimby. A lot of what I'm reading is from this book, which is going to be on the thumbnail for the video. Okay. So one letter that he wrote: if it were in my power to give to the world the benefit of 20 years hard study in one short or long letter, it would have been before the people, long before this. People were constantly saying, tell me, what do you do? Students, medical students would be writing him letters saying, how do you do what you do? He says, I take this occasion to state where I differ from all classes of doctors, from the allopathic physician, that's what we have today, to the healing medium. There were a lot of people who were mediums, that is, connecting with spirits on the other side of the veil, who were also helping people to heal from physical ailments. Often it would be like Edgar Cayce, that kind of work. So what he says is this, and I agree with him here. This is interesting. All of them admit disease as an independent enemy of mankind, but only the mode of getting rid of it divides their practice. I never try to convince a patient that his trouble arises from calomel or any other poison, but instead the poison of the doctor's opinion in admitting a disease. Now, he says, I deny disease as a truth, but admit it as a deception. So he acknowledges the person is having the experience, but he's saying they're having that experience because they've been deceived. Okay. Started like all other stories without any foundation and handed down from generation to generation till the people believe it, and it has become part of their lives. Later, in a newspaper article about him, someone said, instead of treating the body as an intelligent organization with independent life, he finds the life and intelligence in the person who occupies the body. His process reverses the relationship. And if you've studied the Course in Miracles, that's one of the things it says, that we need to reverse the order. It's not that there's something material causing distress, which causes the soul to suffer. It's that there is something going on in the soul that the body is responding to, and then the material shows up. All right. He does not trace disease to a hidden or mysterious source, or no source at all. Neither does he pay any respect to it as though it came from God. So he's saying no disease could come from God. All right. He's saying that it comes because of the errors invented by humanity that were believed as true. Then he lifts disease from its pretended basis of truth and places it on its proper basis of error. So those are the words that he uses, but those words are coming not from a man, but from through a man, through a person, as the voice of spirit. So what Quimby realized he needed to be able to do was let go of his sense of what we call ego self or personality and be what Katie calls the individuality, the unique expression of spirit. And this is what Albert was just talking about. How do I get there? Right? And Quimby made it a point to live there all the time he was working with his patients. So as a result, there's a really interesting description. A woman who went to him over a few times, she says, he seemed to know at once the attitude of mind of those who applied to him for help and adapted himself to them accordingly. Right? He seemed to know that I had come to him feeling that he was a last resort and with but little faith in him or his mode of treatment, just a little bit, right? But instead of telling me I was not sick, he sat beside me and explained to me what my sickness was, how it got into the condition, and the way I could have been taken out of it through the right understanding. He seemed to see through the situation from the beginning and explained the cause and effect so clearly that I could see what he meant. And then she went on to say that she had been sick since childhood, been through every kind of doctor and all the issues you can imagine. And so it took a little more than 1 or 2 visits to get through all of her thinking about it. And she finally said, he continued to explain my case from day to day, giving me some idea of his theory and its relation to what I'd been taught to believe, and sometimes sat silently with me for a short time. I did not understand much that he said, but I felt the spirit and the life that came with his words, and I found myself gaining steadily. It's not the words. The power is what is doing the work. That's Emma. We'll talk about her later. But it was his centering in spirit that did the work. The words satisfied the intellect, that left frontal cortex that's got to have it all reasoned out. The words did that, but it was the presence that he was embodying that did the work. Yes? All right. So he was the first person in the United States to actually be documented to do mental healing, mind treatments, whatever you want to call it. And he saw it as a very specific science that could not be taught except in observation and regular participation. So he had what it looks like about a dozen students, including Warrenfeld Evans and Mary Baker Glover Patterson, who 10 years later went on her own and married Asa Eddy. And we'll talk about her treatments later. But right now, we're looking at what he did that a few people were able to learn how to do. Okay? The same woman who went to him for so many days said he seemed to see through all the falsities of life. He seemed to make a complete separation between the sufferer and the sickness. And he talked to the sufferer in such a manner that gradually the sufferer's senses would become attached to the new life of wisdom, which his words conveyed. So this is part of why we do not say someone has an illness or a disease. We say they've been diagnosed with something like that, or it's some doctor's opinion that they are dealing with these symptoms, or they are struggling with some symptoms, or something like that. You can say whatever words that are different from you are or own or have the quote sickness, right? Then there is you. So this sickness is over here, whatever the symptoms are over here, and now you're here, right? And as the practitioner, you as the practitioner can let go of your idea that there's any reality to this story that is now called sickness, and focus on the reality of the created being, the expression of the divine that is in front of you, and be that with that expression of divinity with us and through us and as us. Then the person can begin to feel that happening through us, right? Because that energy is what they're picking up on. And besides that, the more fully we're in that place of the divine, the spirit, then the more automatically their own spirit self aligns with it. It's already there. It's already in alignment. So all the barriers against it start to dissolve. So the two come together and they become one expression of divinity in the one mind, which is a language that comes up later. So by being in that presence, and speaking to the story of sickness as if it's not real and helping the person see how it is not real, then Quimby was able to handle documented 12,000 cases in 8 years. Yeah. When I first heard that number, I could not believe that I had never heard of this man in 1999, 98. It's like, what? Right? His first effort in every case was to free the sufferer from whatever held soul and body in bondage, and to make the explanation so clear that the patient should consciously see the whole matter in its true light. So he is not just, in fact, some modern people call him a psychologist rather than a practitioner, because he was working with the mind, bringing the mind into a state of well-being that then allowed the body to be in the state of well-being. There's that same woman that had been involved with so many treatments over so many years. She said, I saw just how my trouble had been made, how I had been kept in bondage and enslaved by the doctors and the false opinions that had been given me. Ow. From that day, the connection was broken with these painful experiences, and I lived in a larger and freer world of thought. So, Quimby was never trained as a medical practitioner. Had he been, he couldn't have done what he did. What he worked from was his experience and his study of the Bible more than anything else. And then, explore all the ways that one might experience being alive. One of the things he says, man's senses are his life, as life is God. Man's faculties function independent of matter. A man could exist with all his spiritual faculties, even if the body were laid aside. Life continues, right? This is an important piece of his thinking. The outer person is the imitation or shadow of the inner or real person, right? So what we're seeing out here is an expression, an incomplete expression of what's going on in here. So if we're clear what's going on in here, then what's out here must align itself. So those are some of the principles he used. But again, his job, as he saw, was to be in this other state of consciousness. And he never told anyone how he did it. But I have some ideas because he had studied mesmerism. So he knew how to turn off the regular thinking and be totally focused on some point now. And when a patient came in, he would be totally focused. There actually was a commentator while he was alive. He said he'd never seen a man who could be so totally focused as Phineas Parkhurst Quimby. So there wouldn't be any other presence in his awareness, no other thought except to be totally with the real person in front of him, right? Not the embodiment, not the illness, but the reality of that person. That's all that existed. Then, as that person's issues were surfaced, either in Quimby's paranormal abilities, which he developed practicing mesmerism, or in the person's words, he could relate. Someone is saying, I get so excited and I'm so afraid and I have all of these symptoms. And you go, yeah, anxiety creates all these symptoms. So he knows these symptoms are connected. So there was some of that intellectual understanding of the relationship between mental state and symptom, but there were other things. There was a guy who called him and wrote to him and wanted to have rheumatoid arthritis addressed. And it was just rheumatism in those days. And he said, well, there are very different mechanisms for rheumatism. I'll have to see you to know what to do for you, which is, whereas other people, he would get a letter saying, my wife's back is in such bad shape and I can't bring her in. And he would write a letter to her and tell her to read it 5 times a day so that she could be strong enough to come see him. Right. So there were cases where he could do it by letter and cases where he felt that he needed to be present. And I think that had to do with how much of what is called rheumatism is just arthritis. It's stuff in the joints, right? And how much of it was the autonomic disease, immune system, the self-immune system fighting itself, which is what most rheumatoid is, right? So he could do that, right? Because he could get in touch with the story where they were battling with their own self. And he could work with that with no problem at all. The calcium deposits in the joints would take some getting the person really shifted out of the mental state in which calcium deposits might be accumulating. Does that make sense? I have a friend who has kidney stones, and every now and then he'll go on a series of a pill called Ph.D, breaking stones. And what's happening is the calcium deposits in his teeth are coming out around his teeth. The little plaque is coming out as well as the kidney stones. And I think it's because in his mind, he's realizing he's breaking up the calcium in his body. But whatever the story is, if we can get at the underlying root of the story, then we can see the healing. What Quimby was sometimes able to do was be so fully in that place of knowing the truth of this person, the symptoms would be gone immediately. And that was what fascinated his students and the students of his students. To know the truth in that state of being where there is nothing in your awareness except that truth and the being in front of you, nothing else except this, that then nothing else exists. Yes, ma'am.
Did I hear you say that if he aligned with the truth for that person, their physical issues would go away? Or
That's
that,
exactly.
okay, so that even if the person themselves had not aligned with that truth yet,
They would align. The power of the truth was so great that the alignment happened in them in the
in
moment.
both of them,
Yeah.
in together. Okay.
His his presence was so full of that they experienced that, the truth, the I am that, I am that I am. And that's the essence of being a mental healer. And that is the essence of prayer treatment. Now we're going to be talking about his student. I don't have enough about Orenfeld Evans's methods to be able to work with his prayer treatments, but I do have Mary Baker Eddy, and I do have Emma Curtis Hopkins, and I do have Thomas Troward. So those are the next three we're going to look at. Mary Baker learned from Quimby, and Hopkins learned from Mary Baker Eddy, and Troward learned on a whole different plane in a whole different way. And that's kind of cool. And if you're British, it's Troward. So, can you imagine being so fully empowered by the truth that you are radiating and focusing that in one place, in one person, so fully that they would experience well-being as a result? Sonia can imagine that. If you can't imagine it, you can't do it. So some of us have been given techniques, hands-on techniques, Senjin Jitsu, Reiki, other things that have allowed us to feel like we are doing something that would allow that to happen. And sometimes it happens because we believe in what we are doing. And that's another way to realize it, that if I believe that my knowing the truth is sufficient, and my focusing on you as being in that truth with me is sufficient, then we can both experience the undoing of the symptoms. And that's what Quimby gives us. Yes, Karen.
I don't yeah. Anyway, so okay, I don't know how to say this, but it's my understanding that much illness is usually from, as you say, some uh, psychological trauma. Um, and often those traumas come in from other lifetimes.
Still a mental state out of which the symptoms occur. It doesn't matter what lifetime.
So, and he was able to tune into that.
And he accepted the concept of more than this life experience. He understood that it was possible to have experience outside of this body, right? I read that line. So he was okay with, you could have picked up a message in a different form and be applying it now. But it didn't matter to him what the source was if he could undo in your mind the idea that that is true, the idea that it is real. That was all his verbal stuff ever did. How can I undo in your mind the idea that what they told you is true?
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mhm. So, and that would apply to aging, that would apply to anything. And Fillmore talked about that part when we get to Fillmore's version.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking, Karen. Yes, Tony.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
I know of a reverend who was diagnosed with a brain tumor a number of years ago, and he's a Science of Mind minister, and he cured himself from the tumor. And the way he did it is he said he imagined or focused or visualized or put himself in a space where he saw a little Pac-Man just
Yeah,
chopping the whole thing away.
that was the tradition in the 80s. Yes, that's how you did it.
So here we have a case where you're not denying it. You're saying, okay, this thing showed up on my CAT scan or whatever. So there's not quite the denial, but his claim is that he excised it in that way. So can it be an and, or?
I'm just telling you Quimby. I'm not saying other treatment methods don't work. I'm giving you what Quimby's treatment method was. Know the truth, know that the report of symptoms is inaccurate. Know that it can't be real. You know, Jane Contra, who knows no science of mind, told Russell Targ, what we have here is some images on film. Let's work on your immune system. Right? And that got rid of it. So, you know, whatever works to have one know that it isn't real. Looks like Dave has something to say to all of this.
It sounds like, though, amongst all of the different prayer treatments, it's still a common, at least a common belief is maybe the diagnosis came from something that happened to us or from a past life or whatever reason, but the spiritual separation and healing from it is all kind of, it's sort of all a common belief. It's just slightly different on how they did it.
Right. The point of this series is to look at all the different hows so that we find the one we resonate with for our practice or can shift back and forth, right? There are times when I can know so fully and be so fully present, it's done.
Right.
And that was true for Nona Brooks, who's another one we're going to talk about. There were times when that was true for her. But
Funny
there
that
are
you-
other times when I need to do all of the talking through and reasoning it out and knowing that it's not real and knowing why it's not real and all of that. There are times when that approach works. But all of it is to know the truth that what is going on at the level of sensations, whatever the sensations are, is not what is real for any of us.
It's funny, I just told her, and she just told me within a couple of days, after all the tests and everything, I'm kind of done with that. You know, I'm to the point where I think it needs to be spiritual from here on out.
All right.
So-
All right. So this is what I know. You are spirit. You are nothing other than spirit. You are spirit manifesting as this form right now. And this form is the perfection of spirit, and it can't be anything else. And if there is any sense of anything else, it's from a story that someone told you somewhere and you bought into, and now you can let go of. And
So
I know that's true for you.
is it correct to assume then that if Quimby were to have seen the X-ray, or was a patient presented to Quimby with the X-ray, there would be no place for that tumor in Quimby's mind? Like if it's not part of the reality, in other words, yeah, it's just
That's
it's not.
interesting because he was a photographer, right? I mean, after he had to sell his business, he had to make something. So he started doing photography using daguerreotype. And he saw everything as an image, a partial image, an incorrect image. Everything is an incorrect image. So the X-rays is incorrect as everything else.
Yeah, it
Or
just
the
doesn't fit
MRI.
into the capital R reality of who the patient is. There's no place for
Exactly.
it.
The capital R reality, the spirit being that the person is, was what he focused on and that was his only discipline, as far as I can tell, was to be in that place of knowing what he called the scientific man, the wisdom, the capital W wisdom, the divine beingness, the Christ mind, if you will, that knows only truth and embodies it and projects it, and everyone around gets to experience. Yeah.
So you mentioned having a sense of what you think his practice was. Are you going to say more about that, or?
Well, he didn't talk about what he did to get into that state. What I know about it is from his work with the mesmerism, which has to do with reducing one's awareness of anything out there and being totally focused on one point, in this case, the being of the person. And there are people who will go into trance by spreading out their awareness. I've certainly done that. You sit there and you let all the sounds, all the sensations, and you're in trance. But that's not how he did it. He did it with the focus. And by being fully focused on the capital R reality of the person, he was able to speak to that capital R reality of that person in a way that separated who they really were from any history that they brought into the room. So all that history was now not relevant. And it wasn't relevant to him, and he used whatever language. And I'm sure it was spirit, because everyone said he would adjust what he was saying to the person present. It would be totally different for different people. And that sounds to me a lot like spirit speaking, right? Exactly what this being is ready to hear, to know the truth of themselves. Linda was going to add to that. And
well, a question, at what point in his healing ministry career did photography come into his life?
oh, much earlier.
Much earlier. So he had the photography and then had the
Right.
career as a healer.
Right.
Because
He
I
had the
find it
consumption.
interesting that with his photography science, if you will,
Yeah,
he really understood what illusion was
absolutely. Absolutely.
at a time when most people, that was really woo-woo.
Right.
But he had a real firm grasp on what illusion was because he could create it.
Exactly. And he did regularly. Yeah. And in fact, one of his patents was for a special screen that would shorten the time the daguerreotype took to form on the material that it was forming on. And so he was really aware of how that was manipulable.
Yeah,
As well.
and I could see where having that kind of background knowledge and training would really help him be able to eliminate it quickly.
I hear you loud and clear. But he had already had the experience of two sudden remissions
Yeah.
of two terminal diagnoses in his own body.
In his own body.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It
Kalinda
almost-
was going to say something, and then Tony.
I was just saying, that would really increase your faith, wouldn't it? And you eliminate those in your own
Yeah.
body.
Right.
Right. Well,
That's
he
like-
had that was what woke him up. He was
Yeah.
buying into everything the ministers and the doctors told him and dying. And then had a sudden, he went for a carriage ride and came back well. Right. That was the first one. His 19-year-old assistant declared that if he put his hands on his back, he would heal the kidney results from the medication for the consumption. And they were gone and they were healed. And what? This had nothing to do with anything the doctors ever had said or any minister ever had said. So that's what, the first one turned him on to mesmerism. The second one turned him off from mesmerism because he realized it wasn't about mesmerism at all. It wasn't about hypnosis. It wasn't about, he would say, put his subject to sleep is what he would say. But the process of learning to do that gave him the tools to be able to do this other. And when Mary Baker is speaking of him later, she actually at some point disavowed her connection with him, which is really funny because there are pictures of the newspaper ads of her talking about his method, but that's another story. But she was calling him that mesmerist because she was trying to convince people that all he did was a temporary healing from hypnosis, right? Using hypnosis so they would but no, these people never had these symptoms again. They were gone. Yeah, Claire wanted to say something. Oh, Tony first and then
Oh,
Claire.
yeah, thanks.
Just a super quick comment. It sounds humorous, but I mean it to be an exemplification. Is perhaps he was the father of photoshopping. Really, where it's like, this is what we'll keep, this is what will go, and let's separate the capital R from everything else and print.
Nice. Claire.
Well, I'm kind of stuck on this idea of mesmerism. So I don't really know what mesmerism, I know the word, but I don't know what it is. Can you share with us more about what mesmerism is? Because that seems like a linchpin in this story.
It was for him. I don't think it was for his treatment process, okay, but for his story. And you can go to the New Thought Media Network show on Quimby and get the specific details. But to look at Mesmer, apart from Quimby's life, Mesmer is a man in France who developed a theory that there was a magnetic flow happening, and that some people were able to build that magnetic flow up so that they could change the way someone behaved by changing that flow. And putting them into trance, putting them to sleep, facilitated that magnetic energy, animal magnetism. That's where the phrase came from. Only what's interesting is he was saying animé en français, in French, and that's soul energy.
Yeah.
But Americans call it animal magnetism.
Completely different.
So, oh well. So this flow of energy was manipulable if one learned how. And if you put some people, not everybody, if some people were put to sleep by someone who knew how to manipulate this energy, then they could be encouraged to do things, that they wouldn't otherwise do. So in Quimby's case, he had a 19-year-old subject who was very, very good at going into trance. And they started going around the countryside, demonstrating the power of this process, okay? Mesmer taught, it looks like about 50 people in France. One of those people came to this country, demonstrated it. Quimby had already had the horseback ride experience. He'd already figured out there was something going on with the mental part of that it wasn't all physical, that his consumption was gone after the horse ran away, okay? So what happened? And then he saw this and he thought maybe there was a connection. So he learned about it and then he demonstrated it. And what he began to see was that often his subject would tell people to take peppermint tea or something for some remarkable problem. And they would take it and they'd get well, right? Mm-hmm. He called them simple herbs. And sometimes Casey did the same thing. He'd tell people to do things that wouldn't make any sense at all. Other times Casey would do some extravagant thing that a doctor of 100 years ago would have done. But often it was just a simple herbal something. And people would get well.
Placebo effect. It's the placebo effect.
That was what Quimby was picking up on, that the mind is the moderator of the healing process. So then it was, okay, how does the mind go the other direction? the nocebo effect, right? If you're starting to, when they're in a subjective state, tell them they're not okay and this is why, they buy into it. And that's why he was yelling at it, literally yelling, and in print, as you know, in large type, and ministers and doctors, because in a church service or in his doctor's office, someone tends to be in a more subjective state. And so if a doctor tells them this is what's wrong with you and this is the prognosis, they're literally hypnotizing the patient. And so he was very upset about all that.
There's
like
a new
Tony
word
wants
for
to
that I
ask.
learned last week. It's called a diagnosebo. And
Yeah.
I learned that word last week and it was powerful. It's like if he's got the, or she, whoever, they have the degree, who am I to question that?
Exactly.
And boom, you've planted the seed deeply and watered it,
Right. And Chopra talks about that in his book, Quantum Healing. People who don't know they have a condition are living just fine, and then someone diagnoses it and they're gone within weeks, right? If not days. So yeah, this is an ongoing thing in our culture. It is not present in other cultures, not at all, only in colonialized cultures, only in what I call empire culture. So that's what mesmerism was. That was how he got interested in it. He discovered that people were subject to other people's words and thoughts, and he demonstrated to his own satisfaction that he could change someone's behavior with his thinking while he was doing that work. And that's when he quit doing that work.
Could you explain the note he would scream at people, the nocebo thing? Could you explain that to me a little bit again?
He didn't do that with his patients, but in letters to the editor or in someone showing up and telling him he was wrong, he would tell them how they were being destructive by telling people what was wrong with them. The hell and damnation stuff, the miserable sinner stuff, but also all of the diagnostics, not to mention the medications, which he called poisons.
What do you mean by nocebo? I don't understand that.
Placebo is pleasant. Nocebo is unpleasant, negative.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So if you're in a doctor's office or a church service, you're in a subjective state, or if you're watching TV, you're in a subjective state, and what they tell you goes in, and what they tell you many times over becomes what your story is in the body, not your truth, but the body's story. And so our job as people who know truth is to be the truth and be so focused on being the truth with this person and knowing the truth so fully that there's no room for that story anymore. And he would, if they still hung on to it, then he would argue with them, the story. He would tell them, now, let me tell you what happened to you. This is what has happened to you. These people, thought they were telling you what was real, but it was a lie. It was something they got from someone else who told them, but it makes it nonetheless, a lie for you. And we will undo this lie now, and we will let you live the truth of your being. And he would go on like that. And typically his sessions were half an hour or so. And if it, as I say, if it didn't happen immediately, it would take that. And then they would come back. And ideally, they would come back several times in the next few weeks. But often they lived far enough away that they would have to, have a break. But when he had the written stuff, it was always read my letter several times a day now for the next several days to get this so it's real. And again, that is his tone in the letter, I am sitting here with you in front of the fire, or I'm sitting here with you by this window as you read this letter. He was there and he was being supportive.
The several
Yes,
times a day is very interesting. It reminds me of the Joe Dispenza practice that I talked about in one of our meetings. Was that this
Yeah.
week or last week? And shared with some of you, because his thing is to to basically read and say these things out loud, whispering to yourself 3 times a day.
Yep.
First thing in the morning when you're really susceptible, end of night, same thing, middle
Yeah.
of the day, you know, he's got
Yeah, Quimby said 5 times a day, which is the same as the Hebrew and the Muslim prayer times also. All right, my dears. Thank you.